Take my hand, I'm a stranger in paradise.
Kismet. It was a movie several times over. It was a musical, a Broadway play, probably performed in dozens of high schools around the country. The word Kismet is Turkish, actually, and it means fate. Technically, the definition is a force that some people think controls what happens in the future and is outside human control. In many homes in the late 60s, early 70s, Kismet was one of those standards you'd find alongside Sorry and Clue and Life, Trouble, Score 4. And this is probably why it shows up in a lot of yard sales nowadays. A fun time for the kids, and sometimes mom and dad would join in as kids were having a little game night just before the Wonderful World of Disney came on the tube. It is another outstanding lakeside game, but there's more to the story, of course. Now, I've covered a lot about Lakeside in a past video. You can go back and watch that one at your leisure. But there's more to tell. The ancient Romans played dice games, of course, rolling against the odds and hoping for specific combinations. Now, following these ancient dice games, the next step in the evolution of Kismet was the invention of playing cards as we know them. But eventually card games were invented that were really focused on certain combinations of cards having a ranking. And of course, we're working our way up to the game of poker. Now, poker was invented around 1880, but immediately on the heels of poker, somebody came up with poker dice. In fact, it was patented in 1881, and of course found its way into saloons and casinos and back rooms over the years. But soon, of course, the dice players realized that they could use regular dice, and they can assign some values to the pips. Of course, you got fewer numbers, you don't have suits, but it was essentially the same objective in the dice games. And eventually a few real solid games came about. A game called General, which is still pretty popular in Puerto Rico, actually. And another one called Hooligan, which, as you can imagine, was around the turn of the century on the East Coast. And finally came around the game of Yacht. Yacht, again with regional variations, was a very popular game about 100 years ago or so. But apparently the earliest written account of the game has been said to be in 1938. Now, I haven't seen any solid examples of that. I looked through all my old Hoyle books and so on, and haven't seen anything written about it until about 1940. Now, the Leicester Game Company in Toledo, Ohio, began to achieve some success in the game industry in the 40s. Mostly what they've produced, and they still produce, are party game books, activity books, things that are geared toward things like baby showers or wedding showers, birthday parties, that type of a game. In 1943, they published a little box of games. It was called Luck, with 15 dice games included, and one of those was Yacht. But for the first time, it was spelled Yahtzee. Yatzie, so it was not quite to the Yahtzee that we're familiar with today. There's also a story that a traditional game was played in Tibet called Yahtzee. I don't know how much credibility that is. If we have any Tibetans watching, why don't you let me know if that's really true? It seems like a fact that might be made up, but hey, who knows? It might be true. Well, now the next chapter of the story involves an anonymous family of Canadians who apparently were fairly well-to-do, and they would play this game of dice on their yacht, literally. And the yacht game is what they called it. They contacted a fellow called E.S. Lowe. You're probably familiar with E.S. Lowe if you're at all in the game hobby as far as collecting goes. The Lowe Company was a major player for several decades in the game business, and Mr. Lowe played the game, made them a few promotional copies, and said, I like this, I want to add it to my catalog. So he made them a deal in exchange for 1,000 copies of the game that they could distribute however they liked. He was the guy that actually created the word Yahtzee with H in it that we use today. You might also recall that he was the guy responsible for bingo. The folks at Lakeside saw this all happening with Yahtzee, and they said, we want to get in on this dice throwing trend. So they came up with the game Kismet. Their game designers played a lot of Yahtzee, I'm sure, but they said, we've got to have obviously something distinctive about it. So what they came up with was the distinctive coloration of the pips, so that you can see we've got black pips, red pips, and green pips. And so that added to the combinations available for rolling the dice. Most references say that the game was introduced by Lakeside in 1964. Sometimes they say 1965. But here's an interesting thing that I found doing my research. This is a vintage 1963 box game, including 2 great games in one box. Spare Time, the perfect parlor bowling game, and Kismet, a strategy of poker, fast action of dice, concentration of bridge. It was introduced by Spare Time Products in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1963. I'll do a video about bowling games one of these days. There's quite a variety of purely bowling games, but there are some variants that are pretty interesting too, so we'll keep that on the list. Meanwhile, regardless of that 1964-65 date, there had been a relationship between Spare Time and Lakeside before this. Now, just briefly, Spare Time came out with their famous bowling game in 1940. This is an original edition, 1940 version of Spare Time Bowling. And, of course, that evolved over the years. Back here on the shelf, you can see I've got a version of it that's dated around 1970-ish. But that collaboration seemed to fade. Eventually, the imprint of Spare Time on the Kismet box went away. The imprint of Lakeside on the Spare Time Bowling became more prominent. So you could see there was a kind of an evolutionary thing going on there. Now, as noted before, the game comes with 5 dice and with the colored pips on it. And, of course, there's also a dice cup. Depending on what version you get, they're more or less sophisticated. This is a little molded plastic one that came with this particular set, 1975 edition. But the really important part of the game Kismet, as well as Yahtzee, is the scorecard. The score sheet there tells you what the scores of the various combinations are, keeps you on track, and of course you can only score in one horizontal row at a time. There are 2 sections to the scorecard. The basic section at the top half. That will give a series of bonuses depending on how much you score in that top half. The bottom half of it, called the Kismet section, has higher scoring entries, and the lower section of the scorecard is where the colors come into play and the various combinations. One of the curious things, I think, is near the bottom there. It's called the Yarborough. Not sure where that terminology came from, but essentially it's what Yahtzee calls a chance. And then, of course, there's 5 matching dice, and which, of course, they call a Kismet rather than Yahtzee, but it's the same idea. There is one other interesting aspect of Kismet, that if somebody happens to roll a second Kismet, a second set of 5 matching dice, then all the other players have to put a 0 in the uppermost available slot on their score sheet. It can really be devastating later in the game if somebody gets that second or third Kismet, because now all of a sudden everybody else starts losing a lot of potential score, albeit they are lower scores. So as you would expect, the turns go like this. Each player rattles those dice, tosses those dice, keeps what they want. That's pretty nice right there. 3 6s. And you're able to roll the remaining dice up to 2 more times. Kismet! Wow, what's the chances of that? That's a pretty nice way to start the game. And so I would enter that score in the Kismet space on the score sheet. Every time I would complete the roll of the dice for that turn, I would total up the scoring combination that I could and put it on the score sheet. If I would, for example, get a full house, like this, I would enter that in that slot. Well, that slot's no longer available, so if I get another full house, I can use that for a 3 of a kind or for the pair. But once those are filled, then I can't use those anymore. Well, I think you're familiar with how that works with Yahtzee. And so if you can't fill in a scoring slot on your score sheet, you have to put a 0 in someplace else. So there's a little bit of decisions made of what you roll based on what scoring you have available. So if I've already used a full house, I'm not going to try for another full house because I can't use it. Now, another interesting thing about a full house in Kismet is that you can do a full house flush with 5s and 2s, or 2s and 5s, but that's all. There's not another combination, so probability of getting one of those is pretty rare. And so that kind of play continues until all the players have filled up their scorecard and highest score wins. Now, the Milton Bradley Company bought E.S. Lowe in 1973, and of course that boosted the popularity of Yahtzee because of their distribution channels. But Kismet did pretty well during that same period as well, because it's unique enough that a lot of people preferred Kismet over Yahtzee. Yahtzee, on the other hand, you could buy a pad of score sheets and you could play it with any kind of 5 dice that you happen to have laying around. Kismet, you needed the special colored dice. Milton Bradley began to come up with different variations of the Yahtzee game, building on the theme and the brand. And Lakeside got on board with that concept a little bit when they produced Royal Kismet. It was a big marketing rollout, but it didn't seem to last very long. There were different dice included with the card suits on them. Slightly different challenge, but it didn't catch on as well as the basic Kismet game that everybody was familiar with by that time. Milton Bradley became a subsidiary of Hasbro. That was in 1984. Meanwhile, Lakeside was eventually bought by Coleco in 1985, and then Coleco was bought by Hasbro again in 1988. So now Hasbro owned rights to both Yahtzee and Kismet. Again, they're different games. They could have probably sustained that, but they pretty much decided to relegate Kismet to the bin, and it faded from view. Now, at the American International Toy Fair in New York in 1997, an organization called Endless Games introduced a suite of classic games. Now, their philosophy was that they wanted to resurrect games that had gone out of print. They're the ones that are still publishing it today, along with a host of other classic games. Now, as I mentioned, any game that was really, really popular in the 60s and 70s, you're going to find it now at yard sales and estate sales and thrift stores all over the place. Kismet is one of those, and if you find it, definitely give it a shot. It's a really good variation of that poker hand type of a challenge with dice. So that's the story of Kismet. Hope you enjoyed our little journey through the history of the game and its manufacturing. And so you all know what I'm going to say. Be sure to play every day.